I want to preface what I'm going to say by saying I published this article and I'm going to say what I'm going to say now, not to frighten people. I'm not an alarmist. However, a threat does exist, and it is a completely avoidable threat as long as we don't allow ourselves to get into this situation. So the purpose of the article and me discussing it with you today is to create awareness so we never put ourselves in this position. So I started thinking back in the summer of 2021, right after the summer Northern Hemisphere, excuse me, for my Australian friends, in the winter of 2021 in Australia, China banned mining. And at that point in time, 50 to 60% of the global hash was centered in China. And we saw a massive fall off. The Bitcoin community as a whole, I think, has looked at that period and said, wow, we were really resilient. And that's true. We bounced back from this. Block times increased briefly, but the difficulty adjustment kind of self-corrected it pretty quickly. And if, we had some periods of 20-minute block times instead of 10, quickly adjusted to 15, and then boom, we're back at 10 pretty quickly, and we were no worse for the wear. In the meantime, the Western miners were raking in lots of dough. Like they were ecstatic, and I think that got a lot more press than anything else. It caused me, though, to ask the question, instead of patting ourselves on the back, that we didn't fail, that we didn't have any major issues. How big would the China ban have had to be, meaning how much hash rate drop, for problems to start to occur? Because certainly we know that if it was 100% drop, we'd have a problem, right? That's obvious.
Yeah.
So at what point does the problem occur? So I started this is the engineer part of me. I started running numbers. And forgive me because I don't have it in front of me. I may be off by small amounts here, but it's in the exact numbers are in the article.
I'll put all your articles in the show notes, so anyone who's interested can go and actually have a look at the Rabbits article and this Satoshi's Hill article.
So I said, well, let's examine a 99% drop first and see what that looks like. Because we know what 100% is. What does 99% look like? A 99% drop. And by the way, is there a scenario where that could occur? I also want to say one other thing I forgot to mention, which is one of the things I try to bring to Bitcoin is a system architect thinking and a belief that we should be building Bitcoin to be money for 1,000 years. So if you put 1,000-year hat on, and don't think about, wonderful what happened in Argentina or what might happen with a spot ETF in the US, but those are all just little blip in the radar things. Let's think about 1,000 years. What could happen in 1,000 years? Well, if this vector of elephants continuing to proliferate occurred, I think there is a path in a 1,000-year window for that to happen. It probably could even happen in a 25-year window. So that's realistic that could happen. Now, then, as you mentioned, what if there were regulatory attacks? What if there was a coordinated eco-terrorism effort? What if there's only like four dozen sites in the world doing 99% of the hash? Could a coordinated eco-terrorism effort take it all down? Those are the kind of questions, right? So I examined that question and I started thinking about, if I was the one attacking, what would I do? And I would follow the following path. I would wait for a difficulty adjustment. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, every 2016 blocks, there is a difficulty adjustment. And if you do the math of 10-minute block times on average, that works out to approximately 2 weeks. So what would, under normal circumstances? So if right at a difficulty adjustment, you cause this impairment, again, whether it was terrorism, but most likely a regulatory attack, you force all those machines off. Now you go from 99% to 1%, but you're 2016 blocks away from an adjustment. But what you've just done is, instead of 10-minute block times, you made it 99 times harder. Therefore, it will take 99 times as long. So that puts it, again, I'm going off the top of my head, it's something like 18 hours. So each block now chugs along at 18 hours. And you're 2016 blocks away from the adjustment. So what does that mean? It means you're several years away from the difficulty adjustment. So at this point, it's not a 51% attack. It's just an impairment of the entire infrastructure. Everything grinds to a halt. Now, at that point, no base layer resolutions, no movements to self-custody, no movements out of self-custody. Lightning channels can't open or close or splice. Just it's dead, right? And we're somewhere on the order of 4 years away from the adjustment. Very scary stuff. So now, if I was on the other side to make matters worse, what I would do is at the end, when you chug through this whole thing, what I call the night terror scenario, as soon as the difficulty adjustment came in and it said, okay, finally, we're going to make this thing a little easier. And by the way, the max difficulty adjustment is only 25, is a 4x either multiplier or 4x divider. So you can't actually make a full adjustment.
Yeah.
But you would make that adjustment in the difficulty. It'd be now 1/4 what it was before. And you'd start thinking, well, it's not going to be 10 minutes, but it's going to be much better. If I was on the other side of it and I was the governance, I would immediately turn on all 99% of the hash rate. Now what happens? Now the block times, which you thought were going to be 10, maybe actually more like 30 or 40 minutes, will become like 2 minutes. And we will blow through in the matter of a couple days all the way to a new difficulty adjustment. So we waited 3 or 4 years for one. Now we're going to blow through it in a couple days. And as soon as we got to the next one, I would turn them off again. So this method of essentially making and impairing the system completely is possible. Now, I'm sure the developers would be out trying to figure out hard forks, and we'd be looking at all kinds of different things. But the point would be, if the goal of Bitcoin is to be the world's money for the next 1,000 years, I think that aspiration would be ruined. And it doesn't mean Bitcoin wouldn't exist, but its aspirations, I think, would be completely dashed. Not with a failure, but just with this impairment. And I believe it would be self-induced, because it only happened because the rabbits and the horses didn't develop in balance with the elephants. Now,
it seems like, Bob, you're talking about a crisis, not an existential crisis per se, but a crisis of confidence and credibility. Because if we expect Bitcoin to function as it does, TikTok next block, and governments are able to manipulate it by virtue of the fact that there are relatively small handful of players, the captive elephants, then that is an absolute night terror scenario.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I debated whether or not to publish the article when I first wrote it. I had this long conversations with myself and a few other people saying, should I put this out there? Because am I creating the roadmap to our demise? And so, because I kind of am, right? To my knowledge, I was the first person to bring this scenario to light. But I ended up by saying, no, by publishing this article, I can increase the odds that we never make this situation possible. Because the article is quite long, and I go through various scenarios. But I'll also say the conclusion is that if we can keep a balance of about 70% of the hash rate, doesn't even have to be 50%, like even just 70% sits with the horses and the rabbits. And especially as well, if we can have 30% of the hash rate be wild, then we don't have to worry about this. Things like the China ban could happen again. We would have a similar sort of tail end of, some sort of a ban or some sort of a restriction, but we would keep chugging along. And I don't think confidence would ever be shaken. In fact, I think the opposite would happen. People would say, it's really not worth attacking this thing because it just keeps bouncing back, right? But if we allow this thing to keep going that way, then I think that's a problem. And I know here, I can't speak for the typical Australian, but here in the US, Bitcoiners, so I'm going to say something potentially controversial here, but I challenge a lot of the Bitcoiners to, as they buy stock in the public mining companies, which are pushing this elephant agenda hard, think about whether or not that's what you want to support. Should you be directing that money to the creation of more elephants, or should you find a path to support rabbits and horses?
All right. So I have got Bob Burnett of Barefoot Mining here with me today. Bob, welcome to the Why Bitcoin Show.
Thanks for having me, Dale.
It's a real pleasure to have you. Our mutual friend, Sir William of Rotherham, introduced us. And honestly, Bill's an absolute legend here in Australia. And I look forward to seeing him this weekend. We actually have a Bitcoin Bush Bash planned in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, it's a wonderful opportunity to connect. But Bill, being one of the founders, is one of the chaps I respect most in this space.
Well, that's awesome. I am jealous of that. That's the first time I've heard of a Bitcoin Bush Bash. And it sounds like you have a wonderful crew there. So hopefully someday I can wander south and join you.
Absolutely, but I do appreciate it. It's a bit of it's a chip in a putt. Let's just say that it's a little further than your average overseas conference.
Yes.
So yeah, Bob, I mean, I've dug a bit into your background in terms of how you actually came across Bitcoin in the first place, and it's really quite fascinating. I wonder, just for the sake of the listeners, whether or not you would mind just giving us the sort of whistle-stop tour of that journey, because I think it's quite fascinating. It's an unusual entrance into this space.
Yes, it is. I've lived a fortunate life. For those of you who are listening and not watching, I'm an older member of the community. So I'm 59 years old. But I started as an engineer and technologist way back in the 80s, designing personal computers. I was on the design team for what I would consider to be the world's first laptop computer. And that led me on a journey through the personal computer industry. I eventually ended up at a company called Gateway, which did have a presence in Australia, by the way, in the 90s. So those of you a little older may remember the Gateway brand. We were a top 10 personal computer company in the world. We actually got our entrance into the Australian market by purchasing a company called Osborne, which was in the early days of Bitcoin, somewhat famous. But I spent my career, that portion of my career, developing technology, laptops, desktops, servers. I was blessed to be able to work on early plasma TVs, LCD TVs, MP3 players, those sorts of things. And I also ran Gateway's international business for several years. It was a wonderful journey because if we go from that period in the mid 80s through the 90s into the 2000s, that was a technological explosion. The personal computer and then subsequently the internet just was a really magical time. I left that industry in 2004 and did a technology incubator. At the time, I was doing my best, but the truth of the matter is that for the next decade, we started something on the order of 25 companies through the technology incubator. It was cool, but nothing rivaled the excitement that I got from the early days of the personal computer and the internet. Very few things in life probably could, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was just an amazing ride. I was in the right place at the right time with the right skill set, and it was just magical. And fast forward to 2017, still running the technology incubator, but I got a phone call from a former Gateway acquaintance. And there's an interesting little backstory with it. I was sitting at home. It was an evening. My phone rang with an unknown number, but it was a Seattle, Washington area code. And I didn't want to answer it. Sure, a lot of people out there, you get that, like somebody not in your contact list phone number, right? You're pretty leery to answer it. I wasn't going to answer, especially at night, right? Later at night. And my wife said, answer it. She's very, very instinctual woman. And when she believes in something or she wants something, boy, I better behave. So I said, oh, okay. I answered the phone. And it was, as I said, it was a guy that I had known at Gateway, but hadn't spoken to in over a decade. And he said, Bob, with a group, we're trying to put together an Ethereum server farm. And they had a site, they had reasonable energy costs, they couldn't get the equipment. And part of the reason for not being able to get the equipment was in the era like 2017, Ethereum was a proof of work protocol, but it was all GPU based. And you needed to you basically needed NVIDIA chips like to make this happen. That was really the only path to it. I happen to have a relationship, and my right-hand man in the company, his name's at Barefoot Mining, Keith Thomas, who was the head of desktop engineering at Gateway when I was the chief technical officer. We had relationships with NVIDIA that go back to the start of NVIDIA. So when NVIDIA was a startup company, the very first company to give them any business was Gateway. First company to ever buy an NVIDIA chip and put it into a computer was Gateway. So as you know, they're a behemoth now, top 10 company in the world in terms of market cap, and certainly well down on the AI path. But we made a phone call, and they, even though we were a small company, they remembered us. They remembered us fondly and said, yes, we will support you if you need to build Ethereum servers. We will give you the chips. Well, that was all we needed. This, by the way, was an order for 350-ish servers. So it was about a $2 million US deal. And we kind of overnight said, well, I guess we're in this business. But we were looking at it as computer guys would look at it, right? Somebody was asking us to build 300 high-end servers, each one that had 8, by the way, NVIDIA GPUs in it, 1070, 1080 class CPUs for those of you who are geek out a little more. Well, we got the deal. We supplied it. It was very profitable for us. And we said, well, we made this for this fella. Would somebody else like them? So we started asking around who would like them. We got a much more favorable response than we had expected, but almost everybody that said they wanted one, but only if we would host it for them. So as a precursor to being able to sell a unit, we had to open up a hosting operation, which we did. And it was profitable as well. So we're making money selling the computer. We started to make money hosting. And then a fair number of people were kind of showing us how much money they were making. And we were like, well, why don't we take the profits we're making and pour it into our own equipment? We started self-mining. This all happened in, let's say, a 4 to 6 month period, at which point I started looking harder at what it was we were actually doing and understanding what Ethereum really was. And I saw the warts. I didn't like what was happening. I saw the movement already try to move away from proof of work, which made a lot of sense to me, to proof of stake, which didn't. I saw the governance. I saw the pre-mine, a lot of the things. Like, you don't need me to tell you what's wrong with Ethereum. But I also saw a massive amount of technical complexity coming into Ethereum. And being a guy who's developed technology for a living, I saw like, this is going to be hard. The likelihood of them pulling this off is low. I still say that today. I also have a background in Austrian economics. I won't bore you with that whole story, but starting back in 2002, I had been studying Austrian economics. And so I then looked harder at Bitcoin and I saw, oh, well, this is constructed differently technically, but also the economic policy behind it, which this thing is trying to be money, made sense. It was sound money. And so we pivoted the company to Bitcoin. We signed an agreement with a company called Bitfury. We couldn't design our own equipment, unfortunately, because we didn't have the ASIC, the chip. But we did the next best thing, which is signed a distributor agreement. So we became the US distributor of Bitfury equipment. And we started building out on the Bitcoin side and then moving slowly to phase out the Ethereum side, which eventually happened naturally because they abandoned proof of work entirely, right? Yeah. So it made it easy. So that's kind of the backstory of how I ended up here. And then I guess I'll just follow on and say that I've been studying Bitcoin intensely from multiple perspectives really since 2018. And I'm still learning today. And I think I possess a decent level of knowledge, but I still learn things on a regular basis about the architecture and some of the technical idiosyncrasies. And I maintain a fascination with it and an appreciation for the technical beauty of what Satoshi put together.
Great story, Bob. Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to Bitcoin, it has so many different facets and layers. And I think so many of us feel like it's kind of a never-ending journey of just learning. And I think as soon as you think you figured out one aspect, you start uncovering elements that you actually didn't know that you didn't know. I think what's most interesting about your story is how your kind of technical background, right place, right time kind of thing, coupled with some sort of innate understanding of Austrian economics. It's a sort of a bit of I'd say it's a rare combination because, the technology piece is potentially more common, but I guess the combination of those two things really primed you for getting a good grip on kind of what Bitcoin was, and at least compared to, I suppose, where you migrated away from Ethereum.
Yeah.
So I guess, that's your background there. And then, you're now in the world of mining. Your company's Barefoot Mining. Tell us a little bit about your current set of services and what you do, and sort of how you seek to differentiate yourself in the market.
When we got started in mining, you all know the backstory now with the way that we kind of wandered into it because of necessity.
Yeah.
But what we found was that by good fortune, we were centered in South Dakota in the United States. And for those of you in Australia, north central portion of the US, not very big population. I think it's a top 15 state in the United States in terms of land mass, but only 800,000 people. So not very dense. There's a massive amount of energy production within the state, wind and hydro, especially massive amounts, and more than can be consumed by South Dakota and the surrounding states. So energy costs happen to be very low. So again, we were somewhat blessed, right place, right time. We started out with a small facility, about 1 megawatt in size, and quickly grew out of that, needed to find a second one. What I learned, though, was that it was a lot easier and efficient to grow in small sizes than in big ones. So, as a business person, you can say, well, let's say I see the need for 5 megawatts of demand. Well, you could go attack that a couple different ways. One way would be to go try to build, find a place where there's 5 megawatts. Well, even in South Dakota, for there to be a substation that has 5 megawatts capacity and to have a site within an economically advantageous radius from that substation, it's low. Those odds get very low. But if you change, and I'll also say, just by the way, rough rule of thumb, if you're doing an on-grid thing, assume about $1 million per megawatt to build that out.
Okay.
So if I need $5 million to go make that 5 megawatt site, I have to actually go find $5 million, right? If I don't, so it's very difficult to get a bank to loan you money. So it means finding investors typically. Well, if I change it and say, well, I'm going to try to get to 5, but I'm going to try to get there a half a megawatt to a megawatt at a time, I change it dramatically. I massively increase the number of potential sites that I can locate in. Once I find one, I shorten the amount of time it's going to take me to raise the money. I simplify a lot of the infrastructure, things like transformers and disconnects and switch gear, a lot of the electrical infrastructure stuff is more off the shelf. I can get it with almost no lead times. When you jump up, so what I'm saying is that by doing small things quickly, I think I can get there faster than trying to do one big thing.
Yeah.
And also, if something in the market condition changes, so if it's going to take me a year to make a 5 megawatt site, and you could say this for 20 megawatts or 50 megawatts or whatever, but if it's going to take me a year, let's say, for that to happen, well, as everybody knows, in the Bitcoin world, a year is 5 years. So conditions might dramatically change from, hey, I started in the middle of a bull run and now it's a bear market. And so now my investors don't want to do it anymore. Now I have all these sort of things that could change it. So this was kind of the genesis of it. And then I realized that there were 3 types of miners. And I put names on them to make it easier. I call them rabbits and horses and elephants.
I love this analogy. You go into it in one of your articles, and I was going to ask you about it. So let's jump in.
Oh, okay, great. I'm glad you found the article and enjoyed it. But the elephants are probably obvious, right? So there's typically public mining companies, although a few private ones, that build these monstrosities, 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts, several hundred megawatts. And as I explained, I call those elephants. And those elephants, they're big and powerful. They're often impressive. There's a lot of headlines within the Bitcoin community about these particular developments. But what you'll notice about them is they take a long time to build out, just like it takes a long time for an elephant to go from conception to birth even, right? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, it's like a 2-year gestation period. Those poor elephant mothers.
Bob, yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So this math, and it's similar, right? You know, because you got all these things, but the fundraising, the regulations, the parts like a 50 megawatt or 100 megawatt transformer. If you've ever seen a piece of apparatus like that go down the road, like they are massive. A flatbed truck with the oversized vehicles, and they have to block the road off, and like that's the sort of problems that you have to deal with in your building at that size. The other issue is elephants are easy to hunt. They're immobile and they're easy to hunt. We'll come back to this maybe in a little bit, but they're very conspicuous, not that hard to find. And if you wanted to kill one or inflict damage on one, you know where they are. Now, the other end of the spectrum are the rabbits. The rabbits are the home miners, the small guy with an S9 in a garage, or maybe a businessman who has a server closet and he throws an S19 in there. Like those are the rabbits. And call them rabbits because independently, none of them are very powerful. Although collectively, they can still do a lot of damage, right? A herd, not a herd of it. What do you call a group of rabbits? I don't know the name for that.
Actually, the collective noun. Who knows?
I don't know. I don't know what you call that.
If it comes to mind, I'll mention it.
Yeah. So for lack of a better term, we're going to call it a bunch of rabbits, right? If you have just a whole bunch of rabbits and you turn them loose on a farmer's field, you know, they're gonna do some damage to that field. But if you start trying to shoot them, they just scatter. Like you might kill a couple of them, but you'll never kill them all. And now they're hiding, and you'll never find them, right? So I think that again, the analogy kind of works that if you're a small miner, you're a rabbit. And then in the middle are the horses. And that's where I believe I sit. Horses are the small to medium-sized commercial miners. They're doing these sites a 0.5 megawatt or 2 megawatts, or even 5 probably would still fit that definition. But they're pretty quick to bring up, just like I explained before. You know, you can grow a horse pretty quickly. Maybe it's a pony, right? But you can get it up and operating very quickly. But it's also easy to move. Like we build everything now in containers or hash huts. So if a better opportunity arose or a threat was imposed on one of our sites, we can get up and we can move in a very short period of time. So we're highly mobile. Again, let's say there was a regulatory threat. Well, we could get up and be gone in less than a week and be somewhere else, right? And protect the asset and protect the operation. So at Barefoot, what we've really come to believe is that, you know, the horse class at least is where we want to live. It's not that we don't want to be big. We would love to have a lot of hash rate, but we're going to do it as a herd of horses. What do you call a bunch of horses? Is that a herd? I'm not sure.
I will find that out too.
Yeah. We better look up horses and elephants and rabbits and find out what you call a bunch of them. But I should know that. So, you know, that's what we want.
Band of horses. It's a band.
Yes, of course.
And then it's a colony or a fluffle of rabbits.
A fluffle. Wow.
And then a herd of elephants. So that
and a herd of elephants. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What was it? A fluffle or a colony?
Or colony. Yeah. Colony is more common, I think.
Okay, I think I'm going to go with colony.
Let's run with that.
Band of horses. That's a good band, a good musical band, by the way, too.
Yes.
I don't know if you know them. Band of horses is a good band. So thank you for enlightening me. I needed to know that.
You can learn something from me today, finally, for a change. I learn a lot from my guests. Or Mr. Google, should I say.
Yeah. So, but this, I think one of the things is I need to add another component to it. So there's a second component to it, which is I use the terms captive and wild. So any of those 3 site types, horses and elephants and rabbits, can also be either captive or wild. So there's really 6 kind of sites, right? And a wild site is one in which the energy generation is done locally. It's not tied to a grid or requires the permission of somebody else. And the captive, it's not an energy source owned by the miner, and it's a permission system. So ultimately, what I want for me, and I think for a large part of the network, is we want a bunch of sovereign miners. And the path to being a sovereign miner is through wild sites. Now, it's difficult to be a wild elephant. I really don't know of any at this point, but there are a lot of wild horses and rabbits. And because of another article, which maybe we can get into later, called Satoshi's Heel, this part of the infrastructure must always be at least in some balance relative to the elephants. There's a lot of momentum within the community toward elephants. I think the elephants somewhat get glorified within the community. And I have very mixed feelings about elephants. I don't mind a few of them existing, but if we're all elephants, we're like any ecosystem, we're completely out of balance. And so you could almost think of it as an ecosystem with only an apex predator is probably not a very good ecosystem, right? They're very close to extinction. But a balanced ecosystem that has a couple apex predators and some mid-range predators and some that are probably primarily prey, provides this balance, and they all feed off of each other. So I think that's what we want in Bitcoin, is we want a balanced ecosystem.
100%. And I suppose let's dive into that Satoshi's Heel. What you're alluding to here, Bob, is the idea that if we have too much of the hash rate concentrated with the captive elephants, there runs the risk of regulatory capture. And you then, in your article where you outline this, actually go into some figures and say, look, at this point, I'm getting really worried. This is what could potentially happen. And so, perhaps talk us through those scenarios in terms of, like how things could actually unfold if we had too much hash rate concentrated with the captive elephants.
Sure. I want to preface what I'm going to say by saying I published this article, and I'm going to say what I'm going to say now, not to frighten people. I'm not an alarmist. However, a threat does exist, and it is a completely avoidable threat as long as we don't allow ourselves to get into this situation. So the purpose of the article and me discussing it with you today is to create awareness so we never put ourselves in this position. So I started thinking back in the summer of 2021, right after the summer Northern Hemisphere, for my Australian friends, in the winter of 2021 in Australia, China banned mining. And at that point in time, 50 to 60% of the global hash was centered in China. And we saw a massive fall off. The Bitcoin community as a whole, I think, has looked at that period and said, wow, we were really resilient. And that's true. We bounced back from this. Block times increased briefly, but the difficulty adjustment kind of self-corrected it pretty quickly. And if, we had some periods of 20-minute block times instead of 10, quickly adjusted to 15, and then boom, we're back at 10 pretty quickly, and we were no worse for the wear. In the meantime, the Western miners were raking in lots of dough. Like they were ecstatic, and I think that got a lot more press than anything else. It caused me, though, to ask the question, instead of patting ourselves on the back, that we didn't fail, that we didn't have any major issues, how big would the China ban have had to be, meaning how much hash rate drop, for problems to start to occur? Because certainly we know that if it was 100% drop, we'd have a problem, right? That's obvious.
Yeah.
So at what point does the problem occur? So I started this is the engineer part of me. I started running numbers, and forgive me because I don't have it in front of me. I may be off by small amounts here, but the exact numbers are in the article.
I'll put it in the show notes.
The first thing, excuse me?
I'll put all your articles in the show notes, so anyone who's interested can go and actually have a look at the rabbits article and this Satoshi's Heel article.
So I said, well, let's examine a 99% drop first. and see what that looks like. Because we know what 100% is. What does 99% look like? A 99% drop. And by the way, is there a scenario where that could occur? I also want to say one other thing I forgot to mention, which is one of the things I try to bring to Bitcoin is a system architect thinking and a belief that we should be building Bitcoin to be money for 1,000 years. So if you put 1,000-year hat on, and don't think about, wonderful what happened in Argentina or what might happen with the spot ETF in the US, but those are all just little blip in the radar things. Let's think about 1,000 years. What could happen in 1,000 years? Well, if this vector of elephants continuing to proliferate occurred, I think there is a path in a 1,000-year window for that to happen. It probably could even happen in a 25-year window. So that's realistic that could happen. Now, then, as you mentioned, what if there were regulatory attacks? What if there was a coordinated eco-terrorism effort? What if there's only like four dozen sites in the world doing 99% of the hash? Could a coordinated eco-terrorism effort take it all down? Those are the kind of questions, right? So I examined that question and I started thinking about, if I was the one attacking, what would I do? And I would follow the following path. I would wait for a difficulty adjustment. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, every 2016 blocks, there is a difficulty adjustment. And if you do the math of 10-minute block times on average, that works out to approximately 2 weeks. So what would, under normal circumstances? So if right at a difficulty adjustment, you cause this impairment, again, whether it was terrorism, but most likely a regulatory attack, you force all those machines off. Now you go from 99% to 1%, but you're 2016 blocks away from an adjustment. But what you've just done is, instead of 10-minute block times, you made it 99 times harder. Therefore, it will take 99 times as long. So that puts it, again, I'm going off the top of my head, it's something like 18 hours. So each block now chugs along at 18 hours. And you're 2016 blocks away from the adjustment. So what does that mean? It means you're several years away from the difficulty adjustment. So at this point, it's not a 51% attack. It's just an impairment of the entire infrastructure. Everything grinds to a halt. Now, at that point, no base layer resolutions, no movements to self-custody, no movements out of self-custody. Lightning channels can't open or close or splice. Just, it's dead, right? And we're somewhere on the order of 4 years away from the adjustment. Very scary stuff. So now, if I was on the other side to make matters worse, what I would do is, at the end, when you chug through this whole thing, what I call the night terror scenario, as soon as the difficulty adjustment came in and it said, okay, finally, we're going to make this thing a little easier. And by the way, the max difficulty adjustment is only 25, is a 4x either multiplier or 4x divider. So you can't actually make a full adjustment.
Yeah.
But you would make that adjustment in the difficulty. It'd be now 1/4 what it was before. And you'd start thinking, well, it's not going to be 10 minutes, but it's going to be much better. If I was on the other side of it and I was the governance, I would immediately turn on all 99% of the hash rate. Now what happens? Now the block times, which you thought were going to be 10, maybe actually more like 30 or 40 minutes, will become like 2 minutes. And we will blow through in the matter of a couple days all the way to a new difficulty adjustment. So we waited 3 or 4 years for one. Now we're going to blow through it in a couple days. And as soon as we got to the next one, I would turn them off again. So this method of essentially making and impairing the system completely is possible. Now, I'm sure the developers would be out trying to figure out hard forks, and we'd be looking at all kinds of different things. But the point would be, if the goal of Bitcoin is to be the world's money for the next 1,000 years, I think that aspiration would be ruined. And it doesn't mean Bitcoin wouldn't exist. but its aspirations, I think, would be completely dashed. Not
Mm.
with a failure, but just with this impairment. And I believe it would be self-induced because it only happened because the rabbits and the horses didn't develop in balance with the elephants. Now,
It's like, Bob, you're
go
talking
ahead, Bill.
about a crisis, not an existential crisis per se, but a crisis of confidence and credibility. Because if we expect Bitcoin to function as it does, TikTok next block, and governments are able to manipulate it by virtue of the fact that there are relatively small handful of players, the captive elephants, then that is an absolute night terror scenario.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I debated whether or not to publish the article when I first wrote it. I had this long conversations with myself and a few other people saying,
Yeah.
should I put this out there? Because am I creating the roadmap to our demise? And so, because I kind of am, right? To my knowledge, I was the first person to bring this scenario to light. But I ended up by saying, no, by publishing this article, I can increase the odds that we never make this situation possible. Because the article is quite long and I go through various scenarios, but I'll also say the conclusion is that if we can keep a balance of about 70% of the hash rate, doesn't even have to be 50%, like even just 70% sits with the horses and the rabbits. And especially as well, if we can have 30% of the hash rate be wild, then we don't have to worry about this. Things like the China ban could happen again. We would have a similar sort of tail end of, some sort of a ban or some sort of a restriction, but we would keep chugging along. And I don't think confidence would ever be shaken. In fact, I think the opposite would happen. People would say it's really not worth attacking this thing because it just keeps bouncing back. Right. But if we allow this thing to keep going that way, then I think that's a problem. And I know here, I can't speak for the typical Australian, but here in the US, Bitcoiners, so I'm going to say something potentially controversial here, but I challenge a lot of the Bitcoiners to, as they buy stock in the public mining companies, which are pushing this elephant agenda hard, think about whether or not that's what you want to support. Should you be directing that money to the creation of more elephants, or should you find a path to support rabbits and horses? And
that brings us to a great sort of segue, because I wanted to talk to you about that there, Bob. So, there are a lot of Bitcoiners who I'd say are fairly all in, if you like. All of their liquid sort of net worth is tied up in Bitcoin, and they want to continue to support the ecosystem. And one of the easiest ways of doing so is obviously buying these publicly listed miners. One of the challenges that we have in Australia is our power costs. I mean, energy is obscenely expensive. The numbers, at least on my side, it differs state to state, but I'm looking at about 20 cents per kilowatt. That doesn't make, as far as I understand, mining economically feasible under any circumstances. So, if the goal here is to diversify the mining base or the hash rate such that we have more wild miners, whether they're horses or rabbits. And I think in principle, from a sort of architectural perspective, it makes perfect sense what you're saying. How do we reconcile that? And let's speak to the Australian audience here who's thinking, all right, well, I'd love to do some home mining. It's not economically feasible. I also want to support Bitcoin miners, but I also don't want to contribute towards creating even more behemoth elements. So what do we do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, you are correct that rates of 20 cents are not going to cut it. So don't do that. My first thought is, while I'm not familiar with all the regulations in Australia, if you can help develop wild sites, though, then that might be the path. So that could be a wind site, but more likely a place like Australia. Like, we're doing some work in biomass. So, there are landfills, anywhere there are people and animals, there is excrement, and you can generate gas off of those things. That I don't see any reason that in Australia you can't develop sites where you're harnessing those energy resources in a wild fashion, which is even better anyway, and making that happen. Now, by the way, I'm not opposed to doing business in Australia. I would actually love to do business in Australia. And part of my mission with Barefoot is to increase the footprint outside the United States. So in 2024 and 2025, that's what we'll be doing. And we're going to focus on wild energy development outside the US. But whether I'm not here to talk today about, Barefoot and promoting my company. So I would just say, if you're out there and you're enthused about supporting Bitcoin, then develop a partnership, find a way to be part of wild mining in Australia.
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two, if you're less technically inclined or you don't have the time or experience to get comfortable with that, then you can make investments, private investments in companies like Barefoot Mining. We develop sites, all these small sites all over. And in fact, I have some Australian investors in some of my companies already. Or you can sign up for hosting deals, and there are plenty of hosting companies, Central America, the United States, South America, and get involved in mining that way. If you do that, like I said, in my opinion, you're at least supporting the horses and the rabbits, and you are fighting against this centralization risk. What you're also doing is, I've been public in saying this, that I believe it is impossible to run a public mining company and do so consistently in the long run within the ethos of Bitcoin. It's why I choose not to be public. And if you're a real Bitcoiner, then it's my belief that probably outside of your family and whatever religious affiliation you have, the next most important thing in your life, in your decision tree, is something good for Bitcoin or not. And so if you're going to buy a public mining stock, you may benefit personally, but is that the best thing for Bitcoin? And by the way, I think very few people have thought of it. I am certainly a contrarian in my view here. I don't think there are very many people in the world saying what I'm saying. You can all respectfully, or even without respect, you can disagree with me. I guess that's completely up to you. But I would just say, I mean, if you look at your investment in the public mining company and say, no, I've thought about it. I've really thought about not only the first order effects, but the second and third and fourth order effects of this. And I believe the best thing for Bitcoin, and then the best thing for me, is to own stock in XYZ company, then you go for it. If that's where your conscience is. But I do think you should ask the question, like have a serious conversation with yourself and maybe some other Bitcoiners about whether or not that really is the best thing or not. And yeah.
This feels like a conversation that we should be having at the Bush Bash this weekend. I'll tell you all about it afterwards.
Yeah.
So with regards to your company there, where are you seeing the sort of green shoots in terms of the actual energy sources? Hydro, whether it's methane, what are you actually finding is the easiest to set up from a wild horse perspective?
From a wild perspective. Okay. From a wild perspective, probably the easiest thing is in stranded and flared gas area. Those are probably the easiest, which are two distinct things, by the way. And just to clarify, so flared gas would typically mean you found a site where there's oil, and as a byproduct of getting the oil out of the ground, you have to typically burn a lot of CO2 and methane and things like that. That from an environmental perspective, that's typically what you have to do. So the idea there is, hey, I'm going to divert the gas instead into ultimately a generator that will feed Bitcoin mining. Now, in flared gas, you typically have, and by the way, I'm not a gas expert, so I don't want to say that this is my area of expertise, but I know the basics. Typically, you have to treat that gas. It's usually wet. So because if you think about it, like there's a big repository of oil, and then sitting on top of it is a bunch of gas. A bunch of the oil essentially has evaporated into the air or is in the form of vapor. And so when you pull the gas out, it's wet, meaning there's a lot of those particles in there. So you typically have to pull it through a separator, get rid of that sort of stuff, and either sell it or dispose of it. And so it's a little more expensive. Stranded gas means you have found a natural gas source, typically no oil or very, very little oil. It's all in gas form. It tends to be dry gas, meaning it doesn't require that separation process. It also typically has a bigger basin of gas. So one of the things with flared gas, which is important, it can be done well, but you often find that different reservoirs have a little bit less consistency in how the gas comes out. And it tends to have a decline curve, they call it, which is the rate at which the gas is available goes down more rapidly than in a stranded gas situation. But anyway, those are the two. The stranded gas, by the way, so the thing about both of these is that the gas itself is too far from a pipeline. So, like as an example, in Pennsylvania, in the United States, there's a lot of gas up there. Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, that area, a lot of natural gas. There are only a couple pipelines though. And those pipelines, if I let's say I own some land and I'm 30 kilometers away from the main pipeline, it may as well be 5,000 kilometers away because there's just no way for me to economically build a line between my property and that. Plus, I may have to get permission from 15 different landowners and share the revenue. And they're very complex deals.
Yeah.
So Bitcoin offers a phenomenal opportunity for those people who own those resources, because now they can not have to deal with any of that. They may not get the same price for the gas as they would get if they were connected, but they have no capital investment. Somebody comes in, extracts the gas. And so it's one of those win-win situations.
Okay. Yeah. I think that makes sense there, Bob. Just to clarify on the sort of excrement side of things, because I'm imagining here in Australia, there are these massive ranches that sort of cover, tens of thousands of hectares, and there's just wild, they're not wild, but Brahmin cattle, and you've got these massive stations. And I'm just wondering, do you think that these stations could find a way to sort of, collect all of this excrement lying around their massive property? Or how in practice does it actually work if one was going to use excrement and then I guess some of the emissions from that to power up a generator to then mine Bitcoin?
You would be, if you have, let's say 10,000 head of some breed, and it's scattered over, several thousand hectares, well, that's going to be a hard one because the excrement's going to be all spread out.
Yeah.
So you're going to find that it's more advantageous in situations where you have the animals in a tighter confinement. So now typically, I can't speak to Australian practices, but in most places, for instance, hogs are raised in confinement. And a lot of cattle, dairy cattle, for instance, they typically are in more of a confinement because you have to milk them every day, right?
Yeah.
So that their excrement is going to be also confined and now harvestable. And so that's really
pretty obvious. Yeah, actually, now that I think of it, it's a bit of a silly question, because he's going to go run around the whole farm picking up all this stuff. Much easier if you just went to some sort of factory processed kind of place where they're all kind of animals more confined. Another question, though, and I think about this a lot when it comes to, I guess, some of the more interesting opportunities, whether it's the sort of hydro in places like Africa, where, I think in the Congo and those sorts of places, they've got serious amounts of waterfalls. One of the challenges, I imagine, is political risk. And it's something that I feel like, at least like in South Africa or Namibia or any of those sort of sub-Saharan countries, they've got some sort of potentially abundant energy. Maybe even in Nigeria, they've got oil, as an example. How much does political risk factor into your equation when you're going and thinking, well, where should we go? Because unfortunately, it seems that a lot of these places that are energy rich do have a lot of that kind of risk.
It is a massive issue. In fact, we start our decision tree with jurisdictional risk. So it precedes the cost of energy and the consistency of the energy, which are obviously two major factors, right? But the first thing we do is we call it jurisdictional risk. So there are two components to that. Three really. One component is regulatory risk. So are we subject to laws or regulations that could shut us down or change the cost of doing business? So like here in the United States, states like California are of no interest to me because I feel they present too high a jurisdictional risk. Now, the next piece is there risk of things like theft or terrorism? So if we're talking about some of the types of countries that you talked about, even if the government is accepting, if we're going to go put, let's say, a couple megawatt operation in place and it's several $1 million to put that operation in place, what risk are we taking that somebody's going to steal it and or severely damage it? But it's more theft. I think that's the concern than that. And then the third piece is, I think, one people don't think about enough, which is community acceptance. So again, as an example, let's say in the United States, a state like Massachusetts or New York, there are communities there. I'm not saying they're right or they're wrong. It's not my point here, I guess, but that tend to be controlled by groups that typically would be considered very progressive. And they often view Bitcoin mining with the distorted perspective that it's harmful to the environment. They buy into the typical environmentalist agenda, which is, we're adding this massive carbon footprint and we're raising global temperatures and we're stealing energy that should be helping people and we're raising costs and there are these sort of perspectives.
Yeah.
So even if we don't have the threat of number one or number two, I don't want my employees or potential employees to have to work for a place where they may be ostracized or criticized or somehow made to be felt guilty because they work for me in this place. So anyway, those were three levels of it. The regulatory risk, the theft risk, and then the community acceptance. And those are all wrapped into that jurisdictional risk.
Yeah, the funny thing, Bob, is being a South African, you've already got this sort of inbuilt adversarial thinking constantly. There's a dude across the road from here, and I've just noticed some activity that just strikes me as regular drug deals. And I don't think the average Aussie is picking this stuff up. And so when you're looking at mining sites, I think what you're saying is absolutely spot on. I mean, I look at Africa as being so rich in opportunity from so many perspectives, not just in Bitcoin mining, but unfortunately, if you're going to go and deploy capital there, and let's imagine you can actually do so, there's a risk that, your equipment could be damaged. Governments are routinely overthrown. You could have a deal with one guy, and next day you're dealing with something completely different. The rules can change on a dime. There's not necessarily like a kind of clear distinction between government and the courts. So it's not as if you've got any recourse if you are in trouble. So
yes.
Yeah, it's actually really sad, because in many ways I feel that Bitcoin mining could uplift communities, and in the absence of bad governance and, I guess, crime, one could actually do that. Last question on the mining side, Bob. I feel, and this is just my sort of high level intuition here, but I feel that we have shifted from the energy FUD. It feels that the momentum has been lost, at least compared to, say, 2021. It felt like this was probably one of the biggest issues. I don't know what your sense is, but I don't know, from my perspective, just looking inward, it feels as if the energy FUD is slowly losing the battle.
Yeah, it's not squished, but has dissipated. I think we have to be careful that it doesn't reappear, that we don't rest on it. I did my show back here, it's called Old Man Yells, and I did something on a concept called the 10th man. And are you familiar with this? Have you heard?
No.
Okay. Are we okay on time? So
yeah, no, absolutely. Go ahead
okay.
then. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Tell me.
All right. Okay. So this story starts with a zombie movie. So probably not where you'd expect.
No.
So in the movie World War Z, which is my favorite zombie movie, by the way, my wife I love that genre, right? It's very well done. Brad Pitt stars in it. And his character is a UN investigator. So he's kind of like a UN soldier, right? And this zombie epidemic breaks out all over the world. Every city is being decimated by the zombies. He finds out that Jerusalem has completely contained the virus. So he gets on a plane and flies to Jerusalem to try to figure out, what did they do to be the only city in the world that hasn't been overrun by the zombies? So he's met there by a member of the Israeli Defense Council. And as he's talking to the guy, he said, how did you know to build? So what they had done is they had built a massive wall all the way around Jerusalem and kept all the zombies out, and it had been successful, at least to date, to that point in the movie. So the Israeli guy says, well, if you go back in history and you look at, for instance, the Munich Olympics, this part's real. In the Munich Olympics in 1972, a bunch of Israeli athletes were kidnapped and murdered right in the Olympic Village. And there were other conflicts like the Israeli-Arab War, where there had been signs that an attack was about to occur, but the warnings had been ignored by the Defense Council. They didn't find the threats legitimate enough. So he gave this history. So he said, at some point, they developed the concept of the 10th man. And the concept of the 10th man is this. There are 10 members of the Israeli Security Council. And if, when presented with the facts of a given situation, the first 9 people all agree that they should ignore the threat, that it's not worthy to take action, it becomes the obligation of the 10th person to take the opposite position, regardless of how they personally feel, and they must try to convince the others that they are wrong. So that's
okay.
So you might think of it as a devil's advocate, at least that would be I assume you have this similar slang in Australia.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
But there is a difference between the 10th man and a devil's advocate. A devil, like you and I could be having a conversation and I say something to me and you go, well, I'm going to just play with Bob a little bit. I'm going to take an opposite position and see how he responds. You may not really believe in that position. The 10th man must believe in the position and argue it like his life depends on it. It's like that. So it's a little it's an order more important, right? So in this particular case in the movie, they had gotten intelligence out of India that the zombies were coming, right? And they hadn't seen any evidence of it. And so the first 9 people said, this is crazy. Why are we going to react to the zombies? And the 10th guy takes the position, but actually convinces them to build a wall to keep everybody out and keep them safe. And of course, it ends up being true. So the idea is that, we have to have 10th men. So I go back to that thing, we're trying to build money for 1,000 years. We are going to be attacked. And what are we trying to do? We're trying to create a new form of money and a new monetary system, not two things, right? Money and a monetary system. And if we succeed, even in part, we completely disrupt the establishment, financial, and political system. And that system loses a massive amount of power and a massive amount of wealth. They will not go lightly. So I think it's imprudent on all of us in our area of expertise, when we see an opportunity to be the 10th man, we have to be the 10th man. And we may not convince other people. It's Satoshi's heel again, right? We have to do that. By the way, I forgot now why was I telling you the 10th man story? What was your question?
It was in relation to energy FUD. So it's almost as if
energy FUD.
Do not drop your guard. We might have some momentum, but we must always keep on our toes because they're not going to go without a fight.
Right. So thank you. I got down that tangent and I forgot. So yeah, not every show gets to talk about zombies, right? So
no, it's a first in mind, so that's good to know.
But the energy FUD, we will be attacked. It will continue to be an attack vector, I think, for quite a while. It's not going to go away. But I do want to say something about it. I'm glad you brought it up, because I think as Bitcoiners, the community often makes the mistake of getting drug into the argument too deep. And then we start responding to the attacks, to the energy FUD from an energy perspective. So we'll say, look what we're doing to stabilize grids. Look what we're doing for demand response and base loads and blah, blah, blah. Those are true statements. But it's my belief that as a community, we are being dragged into their battlefield. Our battlefield, we are here, I'll repeat it again, we are here to create money for the next 1,000 years. That's our mission. Even if we consume a bunch of energy, even if it does something to create and increase the carbon footprint a little bit, it's worth it. And we should lead with that. Now, if a secondary effect is like the fact that most of the energy FUD is just that, FUD, but I think always remember why we're here, what we're fighting for, and make that the lead volley. Don't get sucked into their battlefield. And now you get in sometimes into these nuanced arguments. But what they're doing is they're making moral and ethical judgments about our use of energy. I hate that. I think that is completely incorrect. By the way, I think even, I'm a libertarian, so I'm not a conservative or a progressive, I'm a libertarian. And I believe what happens is when you get drawn into these arguments, we're saying, essentially what we're saying is, no, our use of energy is morally right and for the common good. And their argument is that it isn't. But my argument is nobody has the right to make a judgment about my use of energy. Or, by the way, the software that I run on my computers, because what is mining? Mining is just a piece of software running on a computer and connecting into a computer network. That's all it is.
Yeah.
So trying to make judgments about that, that's Pandora's box. So if the bullseye of the target today is Bitcoin mining, and we'll call it the opposition wins the argument. Well, we've opened Pandora's box to them saying, well, PowerPoint isn't a very economical software to use. You like your gaming computers that have great graphics and first-person shooter games, but have, two high-end NVIDIA GPUs in them. Well, you shouldn't do that either, or that's going to be taxed differently. I think it's very important for us to take these positions first and foremost from our position. We're fighting for money, and nobody has a right to tell me what to do with my energy.
Yeah, damn straight, Bob. When I was in, you might not know, but I worked in cryptocurrency media for some time. That was the only way I could work in Bitcoin. And it was an issue that I wrote quite a fair bit about. And to your point, I think, and this is something I also heard from Marty Bent, and he's been screaming it from the rooftops, saying like, don't engage with them on their terms. They are making a moral judgment about Bitcoin. So basically, if you're going to be sitting there and you're going to be fighting each case and going, no, actually it uses less energy, it's the most actually, renewable industry on earth and blah, 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 blah. Actually, what it comes down to when you really boil it down is they actually don't believe that any amount of energy is good for Bitcoin. They actually believe the correct amount of energy is zero. And so It does come down to moral judgment. And then it's then I just tend to go, well, I don't like the Kardashians. I don't think we should stream them. I think it's immoral. I don't like BMW. Where does it stop? And who gets to decide this? And so to your point, I too am a libertarian. And I just think, well, at the end of the day, even if it consumed a ton of energy, from my perspective, it's worth it. Do you have time for one more question there, Bob?
Of course. Yeah, I'm not in a rush.
Yeah, I've enjoyed this. So the last thing is, and this was something that our mutual friend William sort of posted the other day, and it's like, I mean, I must confess, I'm not technical, but UTXO management. And I think you had put something out there, and it's something that I've actually noticed popping up over and over again in all the communities that I'm part of, because I'll see a screenshot and it will say block time like 50 minutes. And you're going like, what the hell is happening here? And then you'll see sort of the V bytes, is the rate is really high, and you're going like, what the hell's going on? So perhaps you can talk to you about like what's causing these spikes in fees, and then sort of why should people care about UTXO management going forward?
Okay. Yeah, there's a whole bunch there. So thank you for asking. And I think it's something I've spent, especially the last year, I've tried to do a lot of education, and I've spoken at several conferences and done a lot of shows about this. So I'll clear up a couple of things. First, don't ever worry about block time spiking. Okay. That's just a random event. Okay. So Bitcoin, we talked about the difficulty adjustment before. So, but what's happening is every 2016 blocks, the network reassesses itself, and it tries to adjust the difficulty up or down to return us to an average of 10-minute block times. Now that's a mean, by the way. So the mean average, not, so for those of you that aren't mathematically inclined, so there's the mean, the median, and the mode. The mode is the most common. If you have a set of data, the mode is the most common number across that. That the mean is just a simple sum up all the numbers and divide by the number of numbers. That's the mean. And the median is the middle number. So if you go high, low, high, low, high, low, high, low, high, low, and you work your way to the middle, what's the middle number? So Bitcoin is programmed for 10-minute mean, but interestingly, the median is about 6 minutes, 40 seconds. So they're actually very different numbers, meaning half of the blocks will process in about 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and half of them will process in more than 640. Yeah. So how fast it occurs is really a random process, because we'll get a little more detail, but basically the miners are looking for a nonce which solves the block relative to the difficulty adjustment. And it could happen in 1 second. And it occasionally does, but it could also happen in 50 minutes. And don't worry about it. Don't try to draw any conclusions if they go a little fast for a while or they go a little slow for a while, unless you're aware of like a China mining ban or something. Just don't pay any attention to it. Doesn't matter.
Great advice.
Okay. So that's part number one. Now, here's where I think some education is really important. Given that we have 10-minute means and over any extended period, the mean will retreat to about 10. Like in the last year, it's like 949, by the way. It's about 949 is the last year. That means if you do all the math, that there are about 53,500 blocks in a given year. That's how much the network will process. Now, each block, we are at a point now in the maturity of the network where every block is completely full. So every block as it's processed is maxed out. And the technical way of describing that is 4 million weight units. It's a way of measuring how much data is in the block, but it roughly translates typically to about 1.5 megabytes, but probably even easier for people to understand, it typically translates to about 2,700 transactions. Okay. So if we have 53,500 transactions per year, that was the number I gave you before, and we have 2,700 transactions per block, multiply that out, what you'll find is a number about 140 million. So what does that mean? That means that in a given year, in the current state of the network, 140 million, I call them base layer resolutions actually, so, or interactions. That's how many can occur in a given calendar year. Now, right now, people are fairly inefficient in the way that they do it, in part because fees have been actually very low. So in other words, let's say I owed you some Bitcoin and I owed somebody else some Bitcoin. I would probably do those in 2 transactions. But going forward, if fees are high, I might do it in 1 transaction, 1 input, 2 outputs, right? Something like that, instead of one input with one output to you and one input with one output to somebody else. I would save money in fees by combining those. So we could probably lift that number up to about 4,000 transactions. It's a crude number.
Yeah.
Plus there are some technical innovations that could slightly squeeze more out of it. But let's just say we could get it to 4,000, 50% more than the current rate. That means we have 200 million base layer resolutions per year. Well, there's 8 billion people in the world. There's 334 million companies in the world, but we're limited to about 200 million base layer resolutions, or we could say transactions. So there's a disjoint, right? So if we have 2% adoption of Bitcoin, let's just say we get 2% of the world that adopts Bitcoin, we're probably at like 0.5% of the world right now. Well, now we have 160 million people on Bitcoin. That means each person can do an average of one base layer interaction per year.
Sure.
So this blows up, I think, a lot of the way people think. And I'm not saying I like this. Actually, I think in the end, we'll kind of come back to this. I think this is the appropriate architectural decision. However, here's what it means. Fast forward X amount of time. It could be a year, it could be 5 years, but let's fast forward to that point when 2% of the population, I'm not saying everybody, I'm just saying 2% of the population is there. Yeah. Well, we're at a point where there's not room for everybody. So holding your own keys is always going to be available to everybody, but at a price. And you have to compete with the other people. So block space meaning room inside a block, is a commodity that is no different than any other commodity. I mean it in a literal sense. It's no different than corn or soybeans or gold. It is a commodity and it is finite. In a given year, there's only 200 million spots. That's it. So if demand is for 1 billion and there's only 200 million, you can see that fees are going to get really freaking high. So if you wish to pay for the security and the privilege of self-custody, you're going to have to pay for it. Otherwise, you're going to have to move to layer 2, whether that's Lightning or Arc or Liquid or whatever, FEDI, these different instruments. And what I'm saying is that something that I'm a Bitcoin maxi, as you can probably guess, but I'm saying something that some maxis, other maxis have problems with, because I'm saying we can't. Not everybody can self-custody. Not everybody can hold their own keys. And in fact, that is a privilege. And if you have a need for it, wonderful. But it's really your very long-term storage. And as institutions come into Bitcoin, I hate to say it, but they are going to be the overwhelming users of the base layer. They're going to move massive amounts of money around and store massive amounts of money. And it's always available to us as individuals, but we have to pay for it and we have to compete. So I mentioned that currently, or for most of the last year, every single block is completely full. Now the mempool, which is the repository of, for lack of a better term, pending transactions that have already been signed from a wallet, they're waiting to be confirmed and added to the ledger. You could think of it as a backlog, a processing backlog. That's varied between like 50,000 and 500,000 continually. And it's not just ordinals and inscriptions. It's way more than that. So the example that I like to give is I mentioned block space is a commodity. And it is scarce. In fact, I believe it is absolutely scarce, just like Bitcoin itself. In any window of time, there's only so much available. So example I like to give is, imagine I have an apple tree. It's the only apple tree in the world, and every day it produces 100 apples. Now, at the point that, let's say, only 95 people in the world want an apple every day, the price of my apples is pretty low. The moment 101 people want apples, it becomes insanely expensive. And it's a very subtle difference between only 6 more people, right? 6 more people takes it from Bob's giving away the apples to I'm charging a premium for the apples. When 200 people want apples, I'm buying islands, right? So we as a community have lived in a world for the last year or so where the block space is equivalent to the 95 apples. And on occasion, when ordinals happened or inscriptions, it's pushed the demand to 105.
Yeah.
And it's a non-linear reaction though, right? It's not. So when you see oh, hey, fees are 3 sats per V byte, and then you come back and you go, oh, it's 200 sats per V byte or something like, or even 25. You go, oh my God, what happened? It's so expensive. Why is it 8 times or 20 times? Well, that's scarcity. That's the power of scarcity. And interestingly, I think we almost see the power of the scarcity more in block space than you do even in Bitcoin itself right now. So anyway, that was a long rambling thing. I'll let you interject.
So practically there, Bob, just practically speaking then today, I mean, I think what you're saying makes sense. It actually resonates with a lot of what I've heard from people in the community here in terms of the fact that, we just don't have enough block space to be able to accommodate the world on layer 1. What should people be doing today? Because what I'm imagining you saying actually is kind of going, well, in the future, if I've got, let's say, half a Bitcoin and I want to move that to a new setup, I could, maybe that's in 10 years time, I suddenly look up and go, oh shit, I have to give away like a quarter of this simply just to move it to a new address potentially because the fees are so high. And I guess the real question then is, what should people be doing today in terms of UTXO management so that in the future they have more optionality? I think that's the key question.
Sure. Yeah. I apologize. That was the original question.
No. That was really insightful.
But I think the backstory is important. Like, why should you care?
Yeah.
Well, that's the reason you should care. So if you, for instance, like, do you have a DCA option from one of the Australian exchanges?
Pretty much all of them offer some sort of DCA. Yeah.
Okay. So let's say you're DCAing $10 a day. Okay. Now, and once a week, you dump that out of the exchange into some form of cold storage.
Yeah.
Well, you could accumulate a massive amount of Bitcoin. That's the equivalent of having a jar of coins, like change, right? So your example, you could have half a Bitcoin, but it's broken up into, I don't know, 20,000 sat pieces.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a dangerous position because you could find at some point that the cost of each UTXO, that's 20,000 sats, costs, I don't know, 10,000 to move it. So you look at it and you go, oh, I have half a Bitcoin. But what you actually have is a massive amount of administrative overhead to actually do anything with it. So right now, and by the way, you could wait. I think fees are very high right now. It's likely they will dip down again into something reasonable, but you need to watch for those opportunities. Or, so what do you need to do? You need to take all those UTXOs. My recommendation is get them into about 1 million sat or greater clumps. Okay. And I think that 1 million sats, at least in the foreseeable future, is going to be a big enough chunk that if you need to spend it or move it or do something else with it, that you're not going to find the fees being so egregious.
Okay.
So I think that that's very important. Now, the other thing I will say, and again, it sounds a little sacrilegious, is think of the base layer, though, really as long-term storage. So if you think that you're going to have some financial needs that are going to force you to use your Bitcoin to pay taxes, to buy a car, to buy a house, something like that, then you probably want to get that money off of the base layer. And hopefully you can find a trusted place. Now that's the hard part of this answer, right? Who do you trust with it?
Yeah.
Because I don't want you to get trapped economically. By the way, that the term is called dust. So if you have UTXOs that are so small that moving them becomes so cost prohibitive, you don't want to do it. That's called dust. But on the other hand, also remember that it may be difficult to move money in a timely fashion. So if you, let's say you have to pay your taxes, or you want to, you got to come up with a down payment for a house. Well, if you're going to need that money to be accessible, let's say on demand in 1 or 2 days, you could find yourself not even in a position where you can't even buy your way onto a block.
Yeah. Okay.
So
how soon are we thinking this could happen, Bob? When we're thinking, I mean, is it hard to say, or are we talking within the next 5 to 10 years, probably?
No, I think it's much sooner. So here's my prediction. As I said, you've seen the ordinals and inscription stuff cause the fee spike, right? Yeah. We're very close to, and this is in the middle of a bear market. If we hit a bull run, we have the ETFs going hard. We could see ourselves sitting here next year with a fee market that blows your mind. That's possible. It's my prediction that by the end of the next epoch, so I'm talking about the halving right now. Yeah. So in the next cycle, which would go from, let's say, April of 2024 to probably about the end of 2027, that in that window, I believe the block reward is highly likely to exceed the block subsidy. So what does that mean? Currently, on average, over the last year, fees have averaged about 0.335 per block. Okay. So I'm saying expect them to be in the 3 Bitcoin range by the end of 2027, meaning 10x current, what it averaged over the last year.
Wow. Okay. So I guess the message, the TLDR is, if you don't understand what those are, then maybe start there. Then start uncovering what UTXO management is all about. And I think there's been quite a lot of content put out there on that particular issue. I am pretty guilty myself of not actually digging too deep, but you've certainly lit a fire under my ass there, Bob, just to get cracking, at least to start learning, because there could be nothing worse than thinking your setup's completely secure, and then you find yourself effectively being unable to move your Bitcoin because it's just uneconomic. And you just,
Yeah, it could be kind of like, imagine that, let's say I had $1 million US dollars, but it was all in pennies. It's somewhat analogous to that. Like, technically I have $1 million, but could I get anybody to accept it? How do I even get somebody to count it? How much money would it cost me to move 1 million? What would that be? That would be 100 million pennies. I would have to get, trucks, and I'd have to hire security guards, and how much of that value is being eroded trying to move 1 million pennies. On the other hand, if I had it all in $100 bills, it's much more liquid. It's easier to move. I can probably get somebody to accept it. So all these sort of things. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get you to have $100 bills instead of pennies.
Bob, I've learned so much today. Hey, I must tell you, I've really enjoyed today's conversation, and thanks so much for your time. Been very generous with it. Would you like to perhaps give the audience a handoff to where they can find you? I'll certainly put links to your articles that I found really informative. But if you want to just give a shout out to any of the work you do, please feel free.
Sure. Thank you. Well, you can find me on Twitter. I'm fairly active there. Boomer_BTC. Barefoot Mining has a website, barefootmining.com. And then I have a little show that I do called Old Man Yells. You can find it on YouTube and Spotify and Apple and things like that, where it's monologues with me tackling a topic and ranting for 15 to 30 minutes. So if you haven't had enough of me already, you can go get more. So
sounds like fun. All right, Bob. Well, thank you so much once again. And we really hope to get you across to Australia sometime. And so please do think of us. If ever there's an opportunity, we'd love to have you.
I would love to be there. Thank you, Dale.
Awesome. All right. Take care, Bob. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that you got some value out of it. Either way, hit me up on Twitter and let me know what you think. My handle is Dale21M. If you've got any suggestions as to people you think I should be talking to or topics I should address too, I would love that sort of feedback. Otherwise, if you want to support the show, there's a couple different ways you can do that. The first is just to share it amongst your friends and family. The more that people hear the message that Bitcoin and crypto are not the same thing, the better. and I want to help people understand that. The second thing you can do is give me a 5-star review on whichever podcast app you're using. Of course, that's only if I deserve it. And last but not least, if you want to stream sats my way via the Fountain app, I'm not going to say no, but it's not expected. Thank you so much for your support thus far. It means the world to me. I appreciate the hell out of you, and the best is yet to come. Much love, friends. I'll see you on the other side.